Okay, let's now go into some simple demonstrations of what we can do with real application security. You can use it in both client-server environments and in a 3-tier environment. And we're going to look at it working in both. First, we'll look at it in client-server. We'll see what it can do. Then we'll look at how it was configured. And then we'll move on to the Apex mechanism. In the client-server environment, you need to create your RAS users, assign them permissions. I'll show you how to do all that. Then you log on as a RAS user. You actually log on as the RAS user, who may not exist in the database as a user at all. He only exists in the real application security environment. When you've connected as that user, row selection and column projection can be controlled through the declarative techniques that we have with RAS. And that's the important point. It's all done with declarative techniques. I, the DBA, can do it. You as developers don't have to be involved at all, unless you wish to. So as a simple example, I'm just going to work in the Scott schema. So if I connect as Scott, password, Tiger, the account is locked. Okay, let's connect as system, password, Oracle. Right, select star from emp. This is guessing. Let me just connect again. Connect / sysdba, going as the top level user. Okay, I'll recreate my Scott schema.
John, did you want scott.emp there?
That would help, wouldn't it? Thank you. Too much RAS going on here. You'll see why I missed out the schema qualifier in a moment. So there's my scott.emp table and the usual 14 rows. What I'm going to set up is an example where Mr. King, as the president, can see the entire table because he owns the company. Mr. Jones, who is the manager of Department 20, can see only the employees in his department. So we'll see an example then of row filtering, row selection being filtered. Furthermore, I'm going to do some column masking. I'm going to mask the salary column because that's supposed to be confidential. So Jones will see filtered rows and a masked column. Finally, we'll log on as Mr. Smith, who's a low-level clerk, and all he can see is his own row, though he will be able to see his salary. So let's try that. If I connect as King, password King, created him already. Select star from emp. He sees the entire table, which is the idea. He's the president. Then we connect as Jones, password Jones. We run the identical application, absolutely the same code. Note, no schema qualifier. And I see just 5 rows. Furthermore, I've masked that column off. Then, log on as my low-level data entry clerk. Smith, password Smith. And I see just 1 row, and that column is no longer masked.
John,
so that in a nutshell is what we can achieve. Yes?
Several questions coming in. The way you logged into SQL Plus there, Jones, Smith, etc., looks like a normal database user. Is that correct?
No, it isn't. And that is the heart of the mechanism that we're going to see. I'm not a normal user. Let's see who I actually am. Well, I'm connected as user Smith. Well, run a couple of queries, and we'll reverse engineer what's going on. So to start off with, I'm in SQL Plus. We've got the show user command. That says I'm Smith, doesn't it? That looks reasonable. Well, let's go a bit further. See perhaps who I really am. Select syscontext, user-env current user. Go to my user-env context. Ah, that's interesting, isn't it? I appear to be logged on as someone called $null. And indeed, if I look at the database from another session, SQL plus, I'll go in as sys this time, /sysdba. Select username from $session, where username is not null. Ah, that's me. That's this person. What schema am I connected to? It is quite subtle here. Scott. And that's why my queries don't have to be qualified. And finally, what is my actual authenticated identity? Smith. So, as far as the database is concerned, that's the schema logon that you can see there. That's my apparent logon. However, I'm connected to that schema as that user. And if I connect as Mr. King, who am I now? Well, that doesn't change. But my authenticated identity certainly does. That was a subtle question there. It appears to be a normal user, but it isn't. And we can even take it one step further. If we look at, say, select star from DBA users, where username equals...
Watch that, users.
Thank you. Where username equals King. He ain't there. He is not there. So, does he exist in the database? Yes, he does, but only within the real application security environment. That's my persistent session, which is switching identity between whoever I log on as.
John, the row filtering you did looked a lot like virtual private database. And is that what we're seeing?
You can draw a very close analogy. If I set the, who am I logged on as? I'm logged on as sys. Okay, go to my other session. And as I'm logged on as King, I'll connect as, say, Smith. As he had the most restricted view. We'll set the auto trace enable ability so I can see my execution plans. Set auto trace on explain. Select star from emp. Right, and now we can get an idea of what's going on, and you'll see, I hope, how close it is to VPD. I'm issuing that query, and yes, I'm doing a full table scan, but look at these predicates. Operation number 8 has a predicate, filter, ename equals xs_syscontext, $session username. So my filter is such, a predicate that is automatically generated, filtering it so that I only see my row. Whereas if I connect as Jones, I'm generating here, back come the rows in Department 20, generating different predicates. So yes, the effect is very similar to VPD. And I would assume that when we start using this on a very large scale, we'll have to deal with the same problems of performance to restrict the performance impact of executing functions to generate predicates. And of course, indexing and constraints is vital to make this perform well.
And there's a couple more coming in. You masked data in a previous query. There it is. Thanks. Is that data redaction? And I thought we had to pay for that.
It's similar to data redaction, but it isn't. And furthermore, whereas data redaction, yes, I was looking at this only the other day. Data redaction, very nice facility indeed, the way you can mask columns at the final stage of projecting the column and returning back to the user. And yes, you've got to pay for that. It's part of advanced security options, isn't it? This is a similar effect, but it's bundled with RAS, so included with Enterprise Edition. Okay.
One last question here. You mapped Smith essentially with RAS. You mapped it to the Scott schema, and maybe my terminology is not great there. Could you map it to multiple database schemas?
Not easily. Not easily. Because of the way the user is defined. That should become clear when we walk through the next step, when we actually start configuring it.
Thank you, John.
Okay, so that was real application server in the client-server environment, sort of RAS in a client-server environment. We'll take a very quick look at it in an Apex environment. I'm not going to show you the source code behind this little Apex application. It's one that Gary wrote for me just for demonstration purposes. But if I log on as user king, password king, I'm afraid performance is a bit poor because of the location of the Glassfish server I'm going through. Oops, so that was the wrong URL. Let me choose the better one. And that's a better URL. So I went to the wrong, I didn't go to the correct application. That's more like it. If I log on as Mr. King, very simple application this time. Gary can show us the source code if anyone's interested and if there's time. So I'll have to ask you to trust me on this, but we're running basically select star from emp. And logged in as King, back come all the rows. If I log out and log on as Jones, running identical code, I see the filtered row set, the mask column. And to complete the demonstration of RAS and Apex, I log on as Smith. Oops. And we see filtered row but an unmasked column. So that's what we can achieve. And of course, what we all want to see now is how did I do it? Right. And in particular, we have to emphasize that within the Apex application, there was no programmatic effort whatsoever. All the work was done in RAS. So how is it done? You have to set it up, clearly. And the setup, you need to create a RAS administrator. So normally you would create a special database account to do that. Having created our RAS administrator, we need to create a database role with permissions on whatever schema you're working in. And that comes back to that last question. It's going to be pretty difficult to shift from one schema to another. It's going to be clever to do that. The role will have permissions on the schema. Then the RAS environment, we create users and roles. Then it gets complicated as we create the access control entries. It's all done with access control entries and access control lists that control what a particular RAS user can do in certain circumstances, because that's what it's all about. It's about determining which users can do what to what data in what circumstances. And that we're going to see how to set that up now by creating the policies for masking and filtering, associating the policies with the tables. That's all going to be client-server. And then we'll move on to how we enable it in Apex. So as an example of the code, it does get quite nasty. So I'm not going to type too much freehand. It would be pretty disastrous. What I shall do to begin with, though, is connect/assistdba, and I'll drop all my users. I'll deconfigure the entire environment. That's just so that I can have a fresh start. So I'll deconfigure everything. Did that get everything? Yes, that's got rid of everything. Right, the code we then run to configure the environment. I'll start off by creating a user. So I've dropped my user sec. Sec is the user I'm going to use as my RAS administrator. So give him DBA, give him access session admin, and create him with that password. Right. Log on as him. We log on as him. And create a role. And the role I'm going to create is called AllEmp. So that's a normal database role, and I'm granting everything on scott.emp to him. So, no security so far, until we enter the RAS environment. Within real application security, whenever you see XS underscore, that means real application security. I'm creating 3 roles: emp low, emp mid, emp high. And these are RAS roles. You won't see them in DBA roles. That's all that exists in DBA roles. And to tie the two together, I grant my database role, create role AllEmp, to the 3 RAS roles. And at that point, we're finished with database security. We've now passed over control to RAS. So how do I create a user? And this comes back to that question. Create user, Smith, connected to the schema, Scott. So note, we now have a clean separation between schema and user, something Oracle has never had before. Normally, of course, when we create a user, you create a schema at the same time of the same name. But now I'm separating them. And I'm also going to create my users Jones and King, connected to the same schema. I need to set their passwords. With the set password command procedure. Set their passwords. Then grant them their roles. What I'm trying to show here is how simple it can be. So I've created the users, given them passwords, given them the role I created. Yes.
So this is, you've said simple, but boy, that looks like a lot of typing. Has anybody built a UI for this?
Yes, there is. Oracle's provided one, the RAS ADM tool. It's written in Apex, and it's supposed to make it simpler. Because I have to say, if you think this is a lot of typing so far, just you wait. Yeah, because now it gets complicated. We create a class. I'm not going to walk through the rest of the code. I'm just going to run it at this stage. We create a class, and then we declare an array of access control entries and associate certain privileges, such as select, with certain roles, such as emp mid. The ability to see salaries we associate with the low role. The ability to do everything to the data we associate with the emp high role. That one there. And because of this, user king, I've granted the role emp high to the user king, and the role emp high has all privileges, as a simple example. Then, a few more procedure calls. I would hope that graphical interface would help them walk through this a bit more, would make this all a bit simpler. And finally, apply my policy to scott.emp. And that should have configured the environment. So that gives you an idea of what's going on. Oh, it actually works. And now I can connect as my user, say Jones, password Jones, select star from amp. So that wasn't too bad, was it? Now, it's a bit of PL SQL. The beauty of it, though, now comes when we move on to the Apex, the Application Express environment. Because as you saw, I just had to log on as my user. So that was the procedure, the process, and it works. What did we have to do within Application Express? Not too much. Not too much. So, within Application Express, let me get my browser up.
John, quick question.
Mm-hmm.
What about releases? Where are we with this? 12C and above? 12.1 and above?
This is incredibly precise. It has to be 12.102. We're that precise, 12.102. RAS was introduced in 11 point something. But to get RAS working with Apex, it's got to be 12.102, and it's got to be Apex 5. Yeah, so we're very precise here with the versions. 12.101, you will not get the Apex integration. Well, you would, but you'd have to do it manually. And that's the whole idea. I want to do it declaratively, not with programmatic efforts, which you can aim to with the current releases. So let's see then how we enable it within Apex. The first step is we have to enable real application security for the entire instance. So I need to log on to the internal workspace as the admin user. In the Manage Instance section, we go to Security, and provided it's Apex 5 and 12.102, you will see this link here, Real Application Security. And all I did was change the default from no to yes. Done. So that enables the integration at the instance level. Then you have to go to the individual application where you want to use it. So log out from the instance administrator, and I'll go back in to the workspace I created, which was JW1, and log in as my administrator there. So there is some devolved responsibility. Your overall administrator has to enable it for the instance. Then within a workspace application builder, choose our application. That's the application Gary wrote for us. And shared components. Authentication schemes. So the authentication scheme, you create your authentication scheme using whatever mechanism you would like to use. And this is a very simple one using Application Express accounts. Never mind that. Because what we see lower down, there's a link, or of course you can just drag down, to Real Application Security. So go down to that. And here you see your options. Internal users or external users. We are using internal users, not external. If we move on to external users, well, Gary can talk about it perhaps if anyone does have questions about external users, but otherwise we intend to leave them for a later webinar. But internal users are known to Application Express and get automatically mapped onto my RAS users. And that's the critical point, that as long as we have the current releases of 12.102 and current release of Apex, we can get the automatic mapping of my Apex internal users to RAS users, and that gives us the ability to apply the RAS row filtering and column masking. So you enable RAS in the instance, then you specify how to use it in your applications with the authentication scheme, authorization schemes, internal or external users. The authentication itself remains in Apex. So you provision your users in whatever ways you normally provision them, but then the authentication is delegated, the authorization, I should say, the authorization is then delegated to Real Application Security. And that gives us the ability to centralize all the control. So we centralize the control of who can see what. In this case with Apex, but as demonstrated, the same rules get applied even with SQL Plus or with any other tool.
John, what authentication schemes can RAS work with?
To the best of my knowledge, it will work with any authentication schemes you happen to have. And looking at, for this purpose of this demonstration, we're using just standard Apex accounts. But there's no reason why you can't use any of these. If you already integrated your Apex environment to an LDAP directory, sure, authenticate against that. If you're using Oracle Single Sign-On, sure. In many cases, of course, people will have written their own custom authentication schemes. Now, I do a lot of work, or used to do a lot of work with the business suite. If you've got your users defined in the FND users table, and you're authenticating there, no problem. So any authentication scheme should function. You authenticate, and then RAS will take over. And the clever part is the automatic mapping of the accounts you're authenticating to, in perhaps LDAP, to the permissions that are defined and controlled within the database.
Beautiful. Back to that username mapping to different schemas question. You mentioned it was difficult at best, but our participant here presents a good case. You know, two different Apex applications. You know, user king logs into application 1, wants to use, you know, schema something, schema 1, logs into application 2, wants to use schema 2.
There would be no problem doing that. It could certainly be worked that way. In our demonstration, I can't go that far. It will be done in 2 levels. You must associate the user with a schema. Just as with a normal database account, the user has to be associated with a schema. But when you create your RAS roles, they, of course, can have permissions anywhere. And that's where we'll be doing more complicated work with setting up the policy. My policies were, let's see. Yes, we would have to grant to the, yes, I can see how one would do it. I can see how one would do it. These are my RAS roles, emplo, empmid, empi, and I'm granting them access to the table in the Scott schema through that there. There would be no reason why we couldn't create other roles against other database schemas and grant them to the same RAS roles. That would be the way to do it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for making me think there on my feet. Right. That then concludes our demonstration.